I'm Hawk, and in this video I will be starting a chapter-by-chapter summary of How to Read Literature Like a Professor, a lively and entertaining guide to reading between the lines, by Thomas C. Foster. It is a nonfiction book that gives an extensive introduction to literary analysis of symbols, themes, and contexts. It is highly accessible, full of lots of examples, and thorough, covering many concepts. We will start with the preface. Foster shares how students at the college he teaches at have been an inspiration for the book. He has learned from them that it is best to show readers the ropes of literary analysis and then stand aside. He then states the purpose of the book, explaining, "The book is about figurative meaning and the way meaning deflects from one object or action or event at the surface level to something else on another." He finishes by thanking high school teachers who have assigned his books in classes and young people for showing engagement in literature. Next is the introduction, which begins with presenting the phrase language of reading, which is a set of conventions and codes writers follow that has been developed over time and is constantly changing. The process of reading, to Foster, is recognizing these conventions. Recognizing these conventions in the text is to identify symbols, consider patterns, and use memories to make connections. Foster gives examples of what these patterns might be, like a deal with the devil, where a character must sacrifice their soul for favors. In the theatrical play, A Raisin in the Sun, a meek man, Mr. Linder, tries to berid his white neighborhood of a black family by offering the father, Mr. Younger, a large sum of money for their house. Mr. Younger must decide if he is willing to accept such a bribe at the cost of his self-respect. This illustrates how the deal with the devil trope may not appear as we expect it to, and requires analysis and pattern recognition to uncover and appreciate. The chapter ends with another statement of the purpose of the book, a broad introduction to codes and patterns that inform our readings. Finally, the first chapter, entitled Every Trip is a Quest, Except When It's Not. The chapter begins with a story where a teenage boy is heading to the grocery store on his bike to get bread for his mom in the summer of 1968. On the way, he has an unpleasant encounter with a German Shepherd and sees his crush with another guy. When he gets to the store and is reaching for the bread, he decides right there that he will lie about his age to enlist in the Vietnam War because he hates it in his town so much. Foster proposes the story is a quest. The components of a quest being 1. A quester, 2. A destination, 3. A stated reason to go, 4. Challenges en route, 5. A real reason to go, which is almost always for self-knowledge. A few more examples of quests are provided, including The Crying Lot of 49, where the main character, Oedipa, travels to Southern California to execute a former lover's will. Along the way, she meets many outcasts and dangerous characters. The main point is that whenever a character is going on a journey, he is likely engaging in a quest. This is followed, however, with the disclaimer that not all journeys are quests, and the rules of literature don't have to be perfect to have value, and they even enrich your experience when you can identify when they're being broken. Chapter 2 is Nice to Eat With You, Acts of Communion. The chapter focuses on how eating scenes in stories are often symbolic of how relationships between characters are. The term communion is meant broadly here as a coming together and not limited to the religious realm. Sitting down for a meal with another person is a peaceful act that forces one to recognize their own and others' humanity in the universal need to eat. Writing a meal scene is so difficult and so inherently uninteresting that there really needs to be some compelling reason to include one in the story. One example of a meal being a transformative force is in the short story Cathedral, where a blind man is visiting a couple's house. The husband is rude and uninterested in the blind man, but after dinner and a smoke, the mood changes and the two men bond over describing what a cathedral looks like. Another example of the meal scene being transformative is The Dead, where the main character's ego is deconstructed over the course of a tense dinner. Chapter 3 is Nice to Eat You, Acts of Vampires. The premise of the chapter is that monsters are often symbolic. Ghosts and vampires are never only about ghosts and vampires. A lot of this supernatural symbolism came from Victorian times, when explicit depictions of sexuality were forbidden. Authors were creative and used monsters as disguised portrayals of sexual themes, and their method survives to the present day. In the case of vampires, they can often show sexual exploitation, like in Dracula, where an evil and attractive male preys upon young, innocent girls. He is deemed scary not only because he is blood-sucking, but also because he personifies unwholesome lust. Ghosts in stories often exist to teach a lesson, like in A Christmas Carol, where Scrooge learns ethical principles from spirits. Monsters don't need to look like monsters either to be in a story. In Daisy Miller, there don't appear to be any monsters, but when the independent female protagonist dies from malaria, Foster argues that it is a vampire that kills her, for the man Daisy loves is a vampiric character representing coldness and death, while Daisy symbolizes innocence and youth. Chapter 4 is Now Where Have I Seen Her Before? The chapter discusses how reading widely allows one to discover patterns within and between books. Foster declares that there is no such thing as a wholly original work of literature, because all stories are talking to one another across time and space. This interaction is labeled intertextuality, and exists because there is only one story that has always been happening and connects all works. In Going After Cacciato, multiple narrative frames draw attention to this patchwork process. One character falls down a hole in the road, which Foster links to Alice's adventures in Wonderland. Meanwhile, the protagonist's love interest can be viewed as a Vietnamese version of Sacagawea. As you begin to make connections, you'll find your understanding of the novel deepens and becomes more meaningful. Connections between stories are often subtle, though, and many readers will fail to identify them. There is nothing wrong with this, as literature can be enjoyed in its own right. Foster clarifies that identification of patterns can thus be thought of as a reading bonus. Chapter 5 is When in Doubt, It's from Shakespeare. Foster claims here, William Shakespeare is everywhere, in every literary form you can think of. To illustrate his point, he provides quotations from Shakespeare's plays that are so commonplace you've probably heard them, such as, "To thine own self be true," and "To be or not to be, that is the question." Foster hypothesizes that Shakespeare's allusions are popular for a few reasons, including that Shakespeare's works are emotionally powerful, widely varied across many genres, and because his themes, events, quotes, and characters are so widely recognized that they provide writers an easy way to have their readers make connections. In Master Harold and the Boys, a similar figure as Shakespeare's Henry IV is portrayed, a young man assuming power within an unjust system. Chapter 6 is Or the Bible. The central claim here is that the Bible has played a fundamental role in Western literature, and biblical narratives appear in many texts. In Beloved, Seth, an escaped slave who is discovered by 4 white men on horses, kills her own daughter rather than let her be taken into slavery. The arrival of the white men represents the apocalypse, which, according to Gospel, is marked by the arrival of 4 horsemen. In Araby, a young boy tries to buy a gift for a love interest from a marketplace. His failure constitutes a humiliating loss of innocence, corresponding to Adam and Eve's in the Garden of Eden. Characters in works of literature are also often named after biblical figures, or biblical phrases may make it as titles, like in Steinbeck's East of Eden and Hemingway's The Sun Also Rises. These titles inform the reader of biblical themes found within the text. Foster suggests biblical references are important because when we pay attention to them, stories that appear specific to their historical moment are revealed to be timeless and universal. Chapter 7 is Hanseldee and Greteldum. While authors often make references to famous novels, many canonical texts will not be familiar to the average reader. As a solution, authors draw from children's literature. Hansel and Gretel is often portrayed in stories centering around lost children. In The Gingerbread House, a woman kills a breadcrumb-eating bird and is identified as a witch only by a flash of a black rag at the end of the story. There only needs to be a hint to the fate of the children in the story to incite fear in the reader. Some writers deliberately warp well-known fairy tales to get a message across. In The Bloody Chamber, stories such as Bluebeard and Puss in Boots are rendered in a more feminist light. Foster closes the chapter with a lyrical declaration. We want a new novel to be not quite like anything we've read before. At the same time, we look for it to be sufficiently like other things we've read so that we can use those to make sense of it. If it manages both things at once, strangeness and familiarity, it sets up vibrations. Chapter 8 is It's Greek to Me. Myths to Foster are stories that explain ourselves to ourselves and are deeply ingrained in our group memory, and thus often make their way into literature. Writers have Greek myths unfold in unexpected locations. In Omeros, characters with names from Greek mythology like Hector and Helen live in a Caribbean fishing village. In the series Percy Jackson and the Olympians, mythology comes to New York City. We are likely to associate the word myth with ancient Greek civilization, but that is limiting as myths and stories can be from any culture. Myths can also be updated in an ironic way. Ulysses, while modeled on the Odyssey, does not portray the main character as noble or heroic in the traditional sense.